If somebody came up to me and asked me to describe the Resident Evil series in a few brief sentences, I would be at a loss. Now you could just go with the easy cop-out answer and say it's survival horror, but what does that even mean? What makes a game a survival horror? 1, 2, and 3 all play relatively the same, and then 4 took the series in a completely different direction. So much so that if Resident Evil wasn't in the title, you'd be forgiven for not even realizing they're from the same franchise. Then once the franchise went as far in one direction as it could, it transitioned back to the series' roots, only now with a much stronger focus on more traditional horror. Essentially, it went in another direction for a third time. Yet again, I'll ask the question, what constitutes a survival horror game? What magic variables need to be plugged into the equation in order to meet the requirements for that label? Maybe this attempt to define such an opinionated, loose term is pointless. A game can call itself an RPG if it has a leveling system with no real customization at all. Perhaps a more important question to ask is, what makes a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game? When I boot up one of the titles, what kind of experience am I looking to get out of it? Is it a shooter, an action game, a puzzle solver, or even just a straight up horror experience? Well, the answer is, it depends on where you're at in the franchise's lifespan. This might explain the series' longevity, but is this lack of identity a good thing? Well, I think a series with the length of Resident Evil has no choice but to evolve as time goes on. There's only so many times the player can start in a convoluted maze-like building, solve nonsensical puzzles, and eventually end up in some secret underground lab before it starts to get stale. So change isn't inherently bad, and if executed well, can help breathe some new life into a decaying series. Just look at RE4, which most fans universally herald as one of the best titles of the franchise. Although you don't want to go so far in one direction that the core of what makes Resident Evil comes into question. So, how does any of this relate to Village? Well, I don't think it's a stretch to say the series as a whole has struggled to figure out what it's trying to be, and no game better epitomizes this than Village. The title is attempting to be every genre Resident Evil has dipped into all at once. You want maze-like level design with ridiculous puzzles that slowly leads to the opening of the area? Then there's a giant castle just waiting for you. How about tight resource management that causes every enemy to feel like a threat? Yet again, the title delivers. Maybe you prefer the more action-oriented elements of the latter half of the series? Village has your back. Looking to scratch that RE7 horror itch? Well, boy, are there a few sections just waiting for you. The game is trying to be as inclusive as possible to every type of Resident Evil fan there is. The first half of the game plays similarly to the older style, while mixing in some of RE7's enhanced additions. Although I don't think Village ever gets anywhere near the quality of the Baker estate after its opening moments. The same can be said of the castle, an overall enjoyable part of the experience, but the scale and general design of the area doesn't reach the heights of the Raccoon City Police Department, and it's nowhere near the Spencer Mansion, my personal favorite section of any Resident Evil game. This also applies to resource management, although it would be unfair to heavily knock the game for this considering every RE game has the problem of the player requiring so much ammo and healing that much of the challenge disappears. Village actually attempts to overcome this issue, and I would say it somewhat achieves it. Primarily done through portions of the game where it either throws so many foes at you that you have no choice but to run, or using a group of tough enemies in combination with well executed level design. This is an example where the game's many different facets act as a strength, using the fast-paced action side of the game to create a sense of panic long past the point when individual enemies pose any real threat to you. Sadly, this fix only applies to small individual sections, and does nothing to fix the overall problem once the player manages to sprint past the danger. Although I have to say this Frankenstein's monster of genres does more harm than good. One of the biggest strengths of RE7 is how it commits itself to one central goal. It's trying to be a strong horror experience. The sound design, story moments, characters, level design, environments, enemies, grisly deaths, everything contributes to creating an amazing sense of atmosphere. The title only starts to get worse once it drops that focus for a more action-oriented finale. Village has some elements stepping on the toes of others, or not enough time and resources are invested to fully flesh out what it's trying to accomplish, leading to overall good sections, but nothing exceptional. Alright, that isn't entirely true. I think the beginning is stellar, and one other portion that focuses more on the horror elements of RE7. However, the last few sections of the game are such a strong departure from everything that came before them that the tone is completely destroyed. The transition from a horror-centered style to a full-on action-oriented shooter is a huge problem because the latter directly interferes with the former, leaving the player wondering just what kind of experience Village is trying to deliver. Despite this, I do think this is a game worth playing, especially especially if you're a fan of Resident Evil. The title certainly isn't perfect, but I would say it's an overall good game that doesn't quite reach great because of its contradicting design decisions. I guess this is where I issue the spoiler warning. I'm going to be running through the entire game, so if you want to experience the title with as little knowledge as possible, I would stop watching. With that out of the way, let's dive in.
Well, Ethan Winters. You escaped my little brother's idiot games, did you? Let's see how special you are.
Village starts you out in the Winters family luxury home. I mean, seriously, Ethan, how much cash do you make to afford such a nice house? Look at the scale of this place, and that staircase. I'm guessing all that hush money is being put to good use. Don't ever say the Baker Estate incident was all bad. Alright, the intro serves a better purpose than just marveling at how well off the Winters are. This brief glimpse into the happy family life is meant to ground us in the protagonist's current circumstances. He's living in Europe with Mia and his daughter Rose. The Baker Estate looms over the family, but they're at least trying to move on. Of course, this is Resident Evil, so this snapshot of a peaceful existence has to be brutally murdered right in front of your eyes. Whoops, sorry, did I say life? I meant to say Mia because she's ya done. The attacker is revealed to be none other than series mainstay Chris Redfield, and he abducts Ethan and his daughter. Shortly afterwards, some kind of attack happens on the van carrying the protagonist, and he's left stranded on the side of the road, hitting a new rock bottom. It's here where the game officially begins in earnest, with all the initial set pieces put into play. The goal for the entire game will be to rescue your daughter while trying to survive the insanity poor Ethan is about to be thrown into once again. You can see a lot of influence from the game's predecessor in the initial moments. As Ethan makes his way through the narrow forest track, a lot is done to create a certain tone and atmosphere. In the beginning, all you can hear is the slow crunching of the protagonist's boots against the snow. You can only walk here, making the trip slow and meticulous, feeling the weight of each step as you march toward the unknown. Eventually, Ethan stumbles across a barbed wire fence with a do not enter sign barely visible from the combination of fog and snow, giving the area beyond a feeling of danger. Turn back. This place isn't safe. Although you aren't given much options, so Ethan advances forward. Almost immediately afterward, you're greeted with some bloody feathers. Not a big deal, right? Then that minor inconvenience transitions to two bloody crow corpses. Alright, maybe a little disturbing, but nothing to get worked up over. Only to then be bombarded with a pile of dead birds and even more found hanging above. Soon these bodies start to overrun your vision, and just when you feel surrounded by corpses, one springs to life and starts screeching at the top of its lungs, begging, pleading to be let out of its constraints. It struggles, but it's all in vain. You can't help it, and the bird's screeches echo in the background as you hurriedly walk past. Now the fog has gotten thicker, your vision even further obstructed. You can barely see in front of you, opening up the dangers that lurk in the unknown abyss. The blood trail starts to dissipate, and the shrieks of the bird die down, only for a sinister chord to build up, culminating at the sight of some unknown creature quickly running by, disappearing as fast as it appeared. Not too long after, your fears are alleviated. There's a lone cabin in the woods, acting as a beacon of civilization. Someone must live here. Certainly they can help. Except there's blood found right outside the entrance, and as Ethan explores the inside, stumbling across another bloodied trail, it becomes obvious that there's no salvation here. Whatever killed all those birds has penetrated this haven. The protagonist, in his pointless search, stumbles across a bloodied cabinet. Perhaps some answers lie inside, although whether or not the player is prepared for what lies beyond is another question. As Ethan slowly opens the door, you tense up, waiting for the dark reveal, only for the cabinet to be empty, except for a small mouse that scutters away. A classic bait and switch tactic used in most horror mediums, using the blood to draw attention to the object, implying that something lies in wait just beyond this flimsy barrier. Except there's no such thing, and all the fear and tension was merely a byproduct of your own preconceived notions. A perfect example of environmental storytelling to get the player to feel a certain way. This reprieve is only brief, as the game isn't about to let up just yet. Without warning, something barges in upstairs like a thunderclap, ferociously dominating everything in its path, searching for some kind of prey, although Village is keeping its cards close to its chest, not wanting to reveal too much just yet. By the time you reach the top of the stairs, the creature is nowhere to be seen. having stumbled outside as you drew closer. It's here where the horror elements recede, giving the player some time to calm down and breathe in the remnants of the destroyed village the game gets its name from. As Ethan wanders around this graveyard, some thoughts might circulate through your mind. What could have caused such rampant destruction? Animals lay slaughtered and entire homes are destroyed. Those that are left standing have large sections of their furniture in a state of disrepair. The attack seems sudden. Trash is littered throughout the area. Wagons block the streets and everyday household items lay buried in the snow. Whoever these attackers were, they were merciless, leveling an entire village all in pursuit of its inhabitants. Speaking of people, after stumbling through this destroyed wreck, Ethan comes across one of the few remaining survivors. He seems completely horrified at the thought of something returning and pleads with you to take his pistol. The tension is yet again dialed up to 11 as the old man struggles to survive. Completely ignoring Ethan's cries for an explanation, he's burdened with the knowledge of what leveled his home and has no time for the questions of an outsider. He's focused on one thing and one thing only: survival. The game yet again messes with the player, having the man shoot out the window only for nothing to be there once Ethan turns around, further playing up the reveal of just what is this antagonistic force. Soon the man is ripped through the roof like a rag doll, his body disappearing into the darkness above, with his blood dripping down onto the floor, serving as the only reminder that he even existed. You're given a brief moment to take in this craziness before you too are brought down into your own abyss, greeted by a nest of dead bodies casually stored away for whatever dark purpose. Ethan is disturbed by the sight in front of him. The pile of victims seem endless, with each corpse only adding further fuel to the fire. Tearing his attention away from the grisly sight, a foreign entity lies in wait ahead. It doesn't appear to have noticed us, but Ethan can't seem to move. The emotional trauma of losing his family alongside the atrocity that befell this village is too much for him. A human being's mind simply isn't made to endure this amount of pain. Although, the world's cruelty doesn't pause just because you've been overwhelmed. Just outside of our vision, a creature lashes out, viciously tearing into Ethan's hand, taking with it two of his fingers, with one left a tattered mess. The encounter doesn't end there. The monster slowly staggers towards its prey. We already saw the creature's face, but it's here that we finally get a full shot of the foe the title has been hiding from us so far. An ugly, deformed, werewolf-like entity, incapable of compassion, only having a primal instinct to satiate its own hunger, and you're on the menu. Before I move on to the first Lycan fight, I want to broadly go over the section I just covered and why it works so well. It's clear that Village's opening takes a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil 7 and other modern-day horror games such as Amnesia. All those tools I mentioned that 7 uses, environment, sound design, the clever use of classic horror tropes to instill fear in the viewer, are all utilized here. The entire opening is all about suspense and the fear of the unknown. You're afraid something might jump out and startle you at any moment. The birds suddenly coming to life drives a fear into your heart, and while that quickly subsides, its shrieks help raise the tension even further. The game even taunts you with a brief glimpse of a Lycan only for it to quickly disappear into the distance. The title is slow and meticulous with its reveal, wanting every ounce of dread and terror to build up in the player before it gives everything away. Even the brief reprieve of the village further enhances this, communicating to you that whatever is capable of this level of destruction is not to be trifled with. Even before the first Lycan is revealed, Resident Evil Village wants its players to feel pure, unadulterated terror, holding off on the reveal as long as possible to stroke mankind's biggest fear: the unknown. There's a reason why this bloody cabinet is so effective at drawing our attention and creating fear. When you don't know what kind of aggressor you're facing, your mind fills this void with the endless possibilities. Anything could be on the other side, and that's exactly what we can't handle. You can't come up with an effective method to combat this antagonistic force if you don't know anything about it. You feel naked and vulnerable at the infinite possibilities. Village's opening encapsulates this fear incredibly well, and amazingly instills a fear of the Lycan before you even come to face with one. However, all this effort would go to waste if these werewolves weren't seen as a threat from a gameplay perspective. Thankfully, Village delivers on this front just as well, if not better. The first battle with a Lycan is fantastic and achieves everything it should. It teaches the player the fundamentals of combat, familiarizing you with the shooting mechanics and showcasing how enemies primarily deal damage through grabbing you. In order to prevent this, the player needs to guard when an enemy attacks so that they can take less damage. The area the fight takes place in is large enough so that you can maneuver yourself around, dodging the Lycan's attacks, yet again instilling a fundamental lesson that running away in order to create distance is usually a smart tactic. While this is all fine, it's not the real strength of this moment. What I love so much about this is the Lycan itself. The creature can cover the distance you put between the two of you in an instant. Gone are the days of zombies slowly shambling towards you. These foes aren't going to give you that luxury. The area you're placed in is small, giving an experienced player just enough room to maneuver around, but at this point you're anything but that. So instead you feel constrained by the claustrophobic space. Combine this with the monster's speed and this creates a brawl where the player never feels comfortable. The Lycan is always just one step behind you, only ever giving you just enough time to fire a few shots before being forced to run away. Another advantage of the enemy is its erratic movements. This is Resident Evil, so you want to shoot every foe in the head to conserve as much ammo as possible. With the Lycan constantly moving around, this task proves a challenge, especially for the first enemy in the entire game. What I'm trying to get at here is this tutorial isn't holding your hand. That's because the game can't afford to. Village just invested so much time into making you fear these creatures, and if this didn't translate into gameplay, it would be disastrous. If you can easily dispatch an obstacle, then there's very little reason for you to fear it any longer. Instead, this fight is the exact opposite. This one Lycan puts you on edge, constantly one step behind you, waiting to prey on any mistake you might make. It helps that the only weapon you have access to is this flimsy knife and pistol, both doing very little damage, prolonging the battle even longer. When the Lycan finally does drop dead, a sense of relief washes over you. You overcame such a major obstacle, and you're finally safe. Well, at least for now. With the monstrosity defeated, a sense of calm rushes over you. There's a house directly in your way, and there doesn't appear to be any threats inside. The player is given a respite from the intensity of the prior fight. There's a radio inside, and things are pretty calm, at least in comparison to what just occurred. You make your way upstairs, find some ammo, and then are immediately confronted with another one of these abominations. As it reaches out for you, just beyond the wooden board, the entire hut starts to shake. Dust falls from the ceiling as multiple shrieks and roars cry out in unison. You thought one of these guys was bad? Well, now there's an entire platoon just waiting outside, and they know you're here. Ice-cold panic runs through your veins. Ethan sprints down the stairs, only to find the beast right outside his little makeshift barricade, with each thud bringing them closer and closer. It won't be long before they get another taste of his flesh. Your mind races as each route of escape quickly dissipates into the cold air. The final nail in the coffin being the sudden appearance of this Lycan at the back window. With this last light of hope snuffed out, one thought echoes throughout your mind. You are completely surrounded with no hope of escape. Suddenly, the narrow halls of the house brings on a feeling of claustrophobia. Moments ago, this hut was your sanctuary, and now it's going to be your tomb. Almost as if on cue, a singular wolf breaches the barrier. What follows is an ugly struggle for survival. So in case you didn't get the idea, I'm a huge fan of how this entire moment is handled. You get a brief pause, serving as a reward for defeating the Lycan, only to then realize that was only the warm-up. Everything serves the goal of making the player feel completely surrounded, weak, and exposed. The sound of what could be countless Lycans roaring in the background begging to get another piece of you, and the realization that all your routes for escape are blocked. An excellent job was done here, and I haven't even gotten into the fight. Contrary to what the situation may depict, this lone wolf is the only enemy you'll have to face, but he poses a much bigger threat than the previous one, mainly because of the narrowness of the house. This time there's not enough space to run around and juke the enemy. You have no choice but to face this guy head on. This serves two purposes. One is for gameplay reasons. Village needs you to learn how to block when an enemy lunges at you. Since it's incredibly difficult, especially for a first-time player to properly maneuver yourself around this space, you have no choice but to learn this lesson. Already Village has effectively tutorialized some of its key mechanics, and you haven't even realized it. Pretty well done if I say so myself. The other reason why they shove you in this tight area is to further reinforce the player's fear of these werewolves. I wasn't trying to overly expatiate this moment because I thought it would be fun. Okay, maybe I did a little, but that's not the point. There's no better way to instill in the player a certain feeling towards an enemy than through gameplay. When an enemy poses a threat to you mechanically, it creates an entirely different type of unease. Just the foe's presence can cause turmoil inside you. The thought of, oh god, I have to fight one of these things again, may be somewhat annoying for the player, but if done right, creates a feeling of tension rather than irritation. Thankfully, the latter is what is achieved here, mixing perfectly with the general horror tactics to create a paranoia you won't be recovering from anytime soon. This is kicked into maximum overdrive when Village forces you to face this horde head on. I love this section in a weird, God it hurts so good kind of way. Think of the scare-roused feeling you guys get from Dimitrescu. There's something about running for your dear life from a hungry pack of werewolves that just gets the juices flowing, you know? I've spent a copious amount of time going into detail about how Village ingrains fear of the Lycan into the player. I personally didn't feel that as strongly as I've been making it out to be, at least up until this point. Everything else has been expertly handled, but this desperate sprint beats that terror into you until the feeling is all but assured. You're in a much more open space, but the sheer amount of monsters makes it feel just as closed off as the house. Every moment truly feels like a desperate struggle to survive, where one mistake could make the difference between survival or death. You feel your situation is completely hopeless. There's no way you can face this overwhelming assault. All you can manage is to run away, and even that proves to be an almost insurmountable task. As if things weren't bad enough, things get even worse when the leader of the pack smashes his way onto the scene. I was struggling as is, and now I have to deal with this? Ethan really is screwed, isn't he? Even the way the situation resolves itself feels like pure luck. All seems completely hopeless until the tolling of a bell. For some reason the Lycans retreat, and Ethan just barely manages to snatch victory, if you can call this that, from the jaws of defeat. The beginning of Resident Evil Village is stellar. I've meandered on and on about it because I want you to understand how effective it is. Every little detail, no matter how insignificant, contributes, creating a beginning that may not be on the level of 7, but you can definitely appreciate how well executed this was.
Castle bell heralds danger. They're coming!
No, wait, where's Rose? Who's Mother Miranda?
The bell tolls for us all. They're coming again!
Sadly, this greatness only makes the introduction to the Four Lords and Heisenberg's game show stand out even more. Just look at this scene. We have some crow priestess presiding over a discussion between evil Quasimodo, a Chucky knockoff, the embodiment of the internet's collective horniness, and an NCR ranger whose best days are behind him. Seriously, what is this? Did I take a wrong turn and end up at the Halloween Rejects gathering? You even have Ethan delivering absurd one-liners, asking if he has any say in how they choose to kill him. It wasn't too long ago we were being ruthlessly hunted by a pack of hungry werewolves. Now those same foes are being used as a cheap scare for the Cowboys' knockoff Saw games. Even the moment itself feels as if there's no stakes. All of the Lycan are walled off, so most of them pose no real threat at all. Even the traps all have an obvious solution, with the hole in the cave easily seen before these spikes get anywhere near you. The game just spent so much time creating real fear and tension, and now we're transitioning to this wacky amalgamation of every horror trope the title can think of. The contrast is just too strong, and really undermines the tone the game has been trying to create for the entire length of its opening. It's here where I can first articulate Resident Evil Village's crisis of identity. The series is no stranger to absurdity. You have the unintentional so bad that it's good Jill sandwiches from the franchise's early years, then you get to RE4's embracement of the ridiculous one-liners. Even 7 can come across as unintentionally funny. Who didn't laugh at Ethan trying to pour healing fluid on his stump after Mia cut it off? Honestly, the whole reattaching limbs thing is just kind of stupid anyway, but that's besides the point. The problem is, humor doesn't work in a horror game, and up until this point, that's exactly what Village has been trying to emulate. I went into so much detail just to prove that to you. The tone is extremely important, and all this portion does is undermine all the hard work of what came before it. It's hard for you to feel any tension when you have Heisenberg cackling in the background about American ground beef. everything feels so over the top that the serious, terror-inducing tone completely dissipates, leaving in its wake a cartoonish version of its former self. This contrasting tone is not a good thing, and it's something the game will flip-flop back and forth on many times, leaving the player unsure of just what the title is trying to accomplish. Alright, I think that's enough for now though. There will be plenty of other examples where I can extrapolate on this point. Ethan survives Jigsaw's wet dream, we find out the rejects have kidnapped Rose, and we move on to the real area of the game, Dimitrescu Castle. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that the castle serves as a homage to the maze-like level design of the series' roots, but it doesn't quite manage to emulate them perfectly. A big reason for this is the fortress itself is more linear than you might have expected. That's because you don't actually get to explore the castle until Dimitrescu begins acting like the series' stalker enemy. Everything feels closed off, and there's only one way to progress for a substantial portion of the segment. Ethan gets captured, escapes, gets found by one of the daughters, jumps down this hole, goes through the dungeon, kills one of the daughters, gets the key to the courtyard, makes his way to Thick Vam's private chambers for some R&R, escapes after she pounds you so hard you fall through the floor, and then you're finally allowed to actually explore. Everything I just mentioned has to happen precisely in that order with no room for diversion. This is in stark contrast to 1 and 2 throwing you straight into the thick of things. You're allowed to roam around and get a feel for the Spencer mansion, figure out where you're allowed to go, what's a dead end, and where you might need to bring something later to solve a puzzle. Part of what makes the mansion so good is this Metroidvania-esque backtracking. Having your options limited at first, but showing all the possible routes you could explore leaves the player hungry to uncover all their secrets in advance, like hanging a carrot right in front of them. They feel accomplished whenever they open a locked door and slowly see all the previously locked passageways open up. Typically, the keys open up multiple passageways, allowing you to figure out how you're going to deal with the potential enemies you may have skipped over, and creating a kid in the candy store vibe. Now you have all these new toys you can play with. Maybe one of them will provide a use for this item you've been holding on to, or give you another object to further progress. The linearity and general scale of the castle doesn't allow for this to happen. By the time Dimitrescu is tracking you down, a lot of the castle has already been seen, and there's little to no reason to return to many of the areas. The limited amount of items you do acquire in order to progress are utilized as soon as you acquire them, providing no sense of wonder as to what this item will be used for or where to use it. The courtyard key opens the courtyard and is never used again. The wine bottle is the only item you have at this point, and the amount of rooms you can enter is limited, so the answer is fairly obvious with very little thought needed. In general, the Metroidvania progression is a lot weaker than what the section is trying to emulate. Another problem I have with the castle is the stalker-type enemies. The girl's obsession with the term man blood, and their general demeanor stops me from being able to take them seriously. Let's contrast the vampires with the Baker family. Your first meeting with the Bakers is a disturbing, disgusting mess. These people are the embodiment of the word insanity. Marguerite is trying to feed you her meal, and Jack casually cutting off the arm of Lucas while the boy shouts "not again" is absurd, but in the right way. You're perturbed by the sight in front of you. These vampires are also crazy, but their insanity comes across as exaggerated. The Bakers are so nutty, you have no idea what they're going to do. I mean, Jack literally KOs himself during his first boss fight. All these guys do is suggestively saunter over while relishing in their chase. They don't exude the same terrifying presence as Jack, Nemesis, or the Tyrant. Even from a gameplay perspective, they're weak. Yet again, they can't enter safe rooms, causing Dimitrescu to awkwardly walk away in the middle of a chase. There aren't many enemies shambling around the castle. In fact, there's only 5 monsters throughout the entire place once the big lady starts to chase you, and they only appear in 2 areas. One you never have to return to again, and the other is the courtyard, which is spacious enough that they don't impede your movement at all. This is necessary for a stalker-type foe to actually pose a threat. The other monsters should serve as an obstacle, creating moments where you're stuck between them and the impenetrable lady, causing you to panic and think on your feet to overcome the dilemma. Due to a complete lack of standard enemies in the castle, it's a simple task to lose whoever's following you, making the threat become more of an inconvenience. I believe the reason this decision was made is because of the 4 boss fights that take place in the castle. You have to battle each sister individually and then Lady Dimitrescu. Each one of them requires a fair amount of resources to overcome, and you don't want to risk the player running out of ammo dealing with lesser foes. Now, these daughter fights are mostly fine with the exception of the one in the library. The fight revolves around having to keep this sky roof open to maintain the cold temperature that weakens them. The problem is, the girl just runs around the perimeter of the room not guarding the switch, so it's easy to just camp it and fire at her from a distance. She poses no threat to you and feels as if she's actively running away from you, the antithesis of what a boss should be like in this style of game. However, one of the three musketeers being disappointing isn't my point. These fights actively take away from what makes the earlier sections of the mansion so effective. It's not just the tyrant that makes the police department great. It's the zombies and how they're placed throughout the rooms. You make a mental checklist of the location of every corpse brought to life in a room. Which ones am I going to have to take out in order to proceed to my next objective, and who can I safely run by? As you advance, you're forced to return to previous areas, and suddenly those foes you skipped over pose a threat once more. Sometimes they'll even throw in new enemies when backtracking to keep the player on their toes. You make your way over with a game plan in mind, feeling confident, only to then have that all turn to ash in your mouth. These enemies are important obstacles that heavily contribute to the tension and anxiety of this style of gameplay. Resident Evil Village abandons these tactics and instead replaces them with boss fights and sexy vampires that suck at chasing you down. With these negatives out of the way, there are some things I like about the castle. The puzzles themselves are good. The statue riddle and the placement of the 5 bells actually forces you to think a little, especially the ones which require some shooting skills and literally thinking outside the box. I've been skipping over the dungeon sections, but they're also quite well done, serving as a mad dash that captures some of the initial like and terror in the opening. As you make your way towards them, there's a lot of environmental storytelling, each cell depicting some kind of gruesome torture method. As Ethan draws closer, you'll hear the rattling of chains informing the player that they aren't alone down here. Rounding this hallway, a groan escapes, and a creature comes shambling out of the darkness. Except it's not just one, but multiple, and just like the Lycans, you aren't prepared for this. You manage to sprint past, only for even more of these horrifying monstrosities to emerge, sending you into panic mode as you fear being surrounded, and then just when you think you've escaped, one of the daughters shows up to add even further ruin to your day. There are 2 other sections similar to this one, the one before you reach Vampire Lady's chambers and the sprint on the rooftops. All of these moments are really effective at driving fear into the heart of the player. The first dungeon scenario was actually pretty easy to overcome, acting as a tutorial for the second, which is far more demanding. Moroikos will jump out of the blood from right in front of you, and the narrow passageway forces you to expend precious shotgun shells so you don't get sandwiched in between 2 foes. The use of enemies spontaneously erupting in front of your very eyes provides that adrenaline rush and sense of panic. If you don't act quickly, you'll get grabbed, and by that time the ones behind you will have caught up. Village pulls off this same trick again, except this time it adds a little spice. These gargoyle-type monsters will chase you across this rooftop. Instead of placing monsters directly in your path, now you're required to think and move quickly so you don't get caught in their attacks. The constant shrieking and enemies attacking you yet again induces panic and unease. I believe all 3 of these sections achieve what they set out to accomplish, and they're a welcome addition to the experience. This is where the real horror elements of the castle are, with the interlude in between serving as a way for the player to calm down and get their bearings. You can't have people in a constant state of alarm or they start to get drained. However, there's another give and take associated with these portions of the castle. The entire area isn't actually as small as I'm making it out to be in terms of pure scale, but when you consider how much of it is dedicated to these 3 encounters, the castle really shrinks in size when it comes to exploration. There's no incentive to ever return to these sequences, so all the space they take up is utilized the one time you visit, making the actual amount of castle that Dimitrescu can hunt you down in and for you to wander around fairly limited, further contributing to the exploration phase of the castle being underwhelming. So that just about sums up everything worth talking about in relation to the castle, except for one thing, that of course being the giant boss battle. Lady Dimitrescu transforms into this dragon-shaped, thing, and shows us the true depth of her own insanity, raving about how she's going to eat us whole, suck out our blood, and enjoy our entrails. You know, all the things her simps would happily have her do to them. The fight itself is good, but nothing special. You spend most of it just running away as she tries to ram into you from each corner. Nothing different from the common run away, pause, and then get a few shots in we've already experienced. The real difference maker is sniping her from the air with the sniper rifle. The time window is fairly generous, but if you mess up, you'll be facing a lot of damage when she flies directly into you, creating a common risk versus reward situation. You could run away and dodge this, but this is also the point that she's most vulnerable to your attacks. Once enough damage is dealt, the second phase begins, which is significantly worse than the frantic attack and dodge maneuvers required before. It seems tense at first, with Dimitrescu right on top of you, trying to yet again ram into you, but you'll quickly realize she doesn't pose much of a threat. The attack itself has an obvious windup, and the majority of the time she blatantly tries to assault the air. The section just felt awkward after the initial panic of the dragon being in such close proximity wore off. I wouldn't say this negative is too detrimental though. The first phase is enjoyable, bringing back that weakness as you battle against seemingly impossible odds, managing to barely avoid death time and time again as Dimitrescu relentlessly hunts you down, successfully losing yourself in the adrenaline-filled encounter. The second portion does hamper this, but it isn't that long in comparison to what came before, meaning the real meat of the fight is from the first stage, with the second serving as the grand finale, although perhaps grand isn't the word I would use. With the defeat of the internet's new favorite waifu, I want to take a moment to give my final thoughts on the castle. The beginning of the video focused on the idea of identity, and that problem permeates throughout the castle. What is the goal it's trying to achieve? The three sister encounters are mostly fine, with the exception of the second daughter, but I personally don't think they were worth having a mostly empty castle for you to walk around in. The uncomfortable chase sequences are high quality, but I think designing the castle in a way that forced the player to return to retrieve something would have improved their overall utility. You could even mix up the arrangement of enemies so the player is shocked by a new hurdle to overcome. Instead, we have encounters that are good in a vacuum, but actively interfere with something else that the area is trying to achieve. Ultimately, the castle is trying to accomplish too many things at once, leading to an overall good section, but not reaching the heights of great. With that over and done with, I want to give some attention to various loose ends that have been building up. Mainly a lot of gameplay decisions and how they impact the title. I've compared the title to Resident Evil 7 quite a bit, but if Village relates to any other game in the series, it's 4. The Duke is literally the merchant. Ethan carries around a suitcase that he has to play Tetris with, there's an in-game currency, and there are even hidden treasures you have to shoot off walls. So that's cool in all angle, but what's the point? Well, let's examine how Village implements these mechanics. How about I start with the Duke and in-game currency? So Dookie allows you to buy supplies and upgrade your weapons. The main thing you'll be spending most of your money on are the upgrades, as they have the most return on investment. However, just like in its predecessor, most of the stats you can actually enhance offer a negligible improvement besides damage. I would argue these side stats were more important in 4 since the entire game focuses on Leon fighting large groups of enemies. Magazine size and reload speed were more important because the game focused entirely on combat. This isn't the case in Village, with encounters usually only consisting of a few foes at a time. Even when there are groups, the best solution is to throw down a pipe bomb, which will do heavy damage or even straight up eradicate the mob if placed well enough. Since upgrades are limited and ammo is plentiful, there isn't much else to spend your cash on besides some blueprints to craft items. Even then, these are cheap one-time purchases. You find every single weapon out in the world at no cost except for 2 guns you can buy from the Duke in the last dungeon. If I stop beating around the bush, there isn't much to actually spend your cash on until the last dungeon. This means you'll have more lay than you'll know what to do with. You get the bulk of your income from treasures hidden throughout the map, but enemies also drop items that you can trade for lay or just the currency straight up. They can technically drop other more useful items, but I found these to be far less common, although that may be my own confirmation bias. I'm making an effort to lay down all this groundwork because the reward for completing optional content is always a treasure that you just sell to the Duke. You like that little pun? No? Yeah, me neither. The problem is, since you have such an abundance of this currency, the reward for going out of your way to complete these side tasks feels incredibly underwhelming, and whenever a Lycan dropped a crystal skull, I found myself groaning as I threw it on top of my mountain of cash. Let's use the Beneviento treasure as an example. You grab the missing half of the cemetery nameplate and head to this gravesite. Once you arrive, a boss you've probably never encountered will spontaneously show up, thwarting your plans. The boss encounter itself is one of the better in the game, but it's not the point of the discussion. The reward for defeating this guy and exploring the world looking for the other half to begin with is 2 treasures that you just sell for some lay. At this point in the game, I had over 200,000 of the money, so the entire thing felt like a complete waste of time. I think it would have been a much better idea to instead hide weapon mod attachments or even new guns behind these encounters. Perhaps the Duke has them in stock, but is unwilling to part with them unless you find a specific item he desires, creating a mystery for you to solve and a goal to strive towards. I really like this shotgun, and being able to further enhance it would make my day, so perhaps I'll spend some time searching for where the trade-in item could be. Technically some guns are hidden, but I use that term pretty loosely. One of the flaws of RE4 was that you could easily buy a map that marked the location of all the treasures in an area before you even got a chance to explore it, completely defeating the purpose of hiding them to begin with. Village does this, and you don't even have to buy a map. The Duke just straight up marks down all the locations of every single one after you get through the next village section. So many of the big treasures and hidden weapons have a giant symbol hovering over them screaming, "Hey, come and get me," ruining a lot of the exploration and side content the game has to offer. So it becomes incredibly difficult to not become rich because the money makers are laid out right in front of you. In fact, Village actually implements a method that does make the player think and gives worthwhile rewards. These pictures are hints that lead to special animals that are needed to cook a meal, which increases your health, guarding capabilities, and movement speed. All of those are rewards that the player actually wants to strive towards, and the locations aren't just given to you straight up. You have to think about where the beast could possibly be, and actually, explore the world. I don't understand why the title didn't implement more treasures and valuable items such as weapon modifications behind methods similar to these instead of just buying them from the Duke. In RE4 this tactic works because combat is the main focus of the title. Progression is directly linked to money as you need to get new weapons and enhance them. In Village this progression is mostly handled naturally without the need of cash besides occasionally upgrading a gun's damage. Even then you get better versions of the pistol and shotgun before fighting another boss. These weapons both deal more damage than their predecessor even if you spend lay upgrading them, meaning if you do upgrade these guns after Dimitrescu, it feels like a complete waste of cash because there isn't another significant combat encounter for quite some time. So up until about Moreau, there really isn't much of a reason to spend cash on the main thing you're supposed to use it on, leading to a large buildup of lay. This snowballs because now you have so much money that spending lay on upgrading the new weapons you get, which is worth it, doesn't put a dent in your funds, only further exasperating the problem of treasures not feeling like a meaningful reward anymore. Transitioning back to exploration, any room on the map will denote whether or not you found all the items it has to offer by either being red or blue. Personally, I think this was a terrible design decision. Even my beloved Resident Evil 1 does this, and I think the title suffers for it. The reason 1 does this is because it's much easier to get stuck within the madness of its quirky puzzles, and its resource management is far less forgiving during the mansion. Village is for the most part pretty straightforward, so I see this as a more egregious sin. It has the obvious exploration problem, giving away much of an area's secrets by informing the player when they miss something. However, there is an exception to this. Only buildings or rooms are color-coded, and any paths you follow down, like the ones in the village, are consistently white, meaning anything placed there can easily be missed. The bigger issue for this design decision is it makes it a lot easier to amass wealth and resources. Let's look at the castle. Every single room is either marked blue or red, so the player can easily gather every low-level treasure, ammunition, and crafting materials the castle has to offer without having to think too hard, leading to an abundance of resources that further contributes to the wealth problem I mentioned earlier. Although there's a much bigger consequence to this issue. Part of the reason the dungeon sections are so effective is you don't have a lot of ammo. Every shot is precious, so you only fight back when you're given no other choice. Yet again, you feel weak in the face of these opponents. If you have a lot of ammunition and tools like the pipe bomb, this weakness starts to disappear. You can easily dispose of them without feeling the resource crunch. With this dread gone, the player starts to feel comfortable, which is never a good thing in a survival horror game. Imagine if you had more shotgun shells and a few bombs when first being introduced to the dungeon. All the tension and anxiety would be gone because you could easily defeat all the enemies. That's exactly what the village section immediately after the castle does. There wasn't a single lichen in the past area, but now they make a return. Only this time you're a dragon taming, vampire killing veteran. What are these measly little wolves going to do in comparison to them? Well, not much, as it turns out they really don't compare now that you have more shotgun shells, a bucket load of pistol ammo, and a sniper rifle to boot. We're only past the first of the 4 lords, and already that sense of comfort is easing its way in. Just one lichen was terrifying, and now we can take on a whole pack with relative ease. I understand some people may think this is a good thing. It gives the player a sense of progression, but is becoming stronger a good thing when it doesn't pace itself with the obstacles the game throws at you? I think most people would say no, but the situation is more layered than that. It's not as if fighting these lichens is boring or poorly implemented. I actually enjoyed the fight quite a bit. From a more typical game perspective, I don't have any complaints. Running through the small town fighting these beasts is a fun part of the experience. The lichen's speed and erratic movements still make them pose a threat, and opening up some of the previously locked gates feels rewarding. There are even a few horror moments sprinkled in. If you run from this lichen, he'll stop chasing you only to jump out further down the path. However, my concern is the overarching feel of the game. What is Village trying to accomplish? What is the tone the game is going for? Is it more of an action-oriented style where the focus is on big boss encounters and fighting enemies, i.e. Resident Evil 4, or is it on making the player feel as unsafe and anxious as possible like 7? The castle is a decent mix of both, with enemies serving as real obstacles, but it still has a significant portion where the player doesn't feel like they're in any danger. mainly because it's easy to amass lots of ammo, and Dimitrescu doesn't do a great job stalking you around. The lichens in the village further contribute to this because they exist so the player has something to occupy their time while wandering around. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem. Like I said before, there do need to be moments where you aren't panicking for survival or else it becomes too much. Resident Evil typically does this through its puzzles and backtracking, and that works quite well. Where it doesn't work is enemy encounters. Look at these Moroicas after the Beneviento house. The initial shock of them showing up is fine, but the monsters themselves don't pose any real threat to the player at all. They practically crawl towards you, their attacks are easily baited, and you have such a large amount of supplies that killing them doesn't feel like much of a cost. The game is just throwing enemies at you for the sake of it with no real challenge. The same can be said of the Varkolak not too long after. The large wolf initially comes across as a problem, only for the game to give you the grenade launcher immediately afterwards. Combine this with it being unable to enter this house, and the entire encounter comes across as a joke. This is the introduction to this beast, and you've already conquered it with relative ease. At least every other mob got a solid moment to shine before you grew too strong for them. This is a real shame because the monster has a lot of potential. Its design, size, attacks, and general presence scream, "Don't mess with me." A much better option would have been forcing the player to bob and weave between hiding spots while it chased after you. Instead, it's just a simple explode the poor thing to death. What's the point of introducing a new enemy in a survival horror game if you kill it right away without much fuss or the situation it's introduced in doesn't cause you to be wary of it? Look, I don't mind having combat encounters in the game, but if most of your title is similar to the style of 7, the action sections of 4 don't mesh well because combat in 4 doesn't rely on fear very often. The fights should feel like a desperate struggle to get by or at least pose some kind of threat to you. You shouldn't be lobbing pipe bombs at groups of 4 and then just go about your business. Implement the horror and desperate struggle for survival into the gameplay. If you want the style of 4 through 6, that's fine, but you can't do both. The two directly contradict one another. One relies on defeating enemies regularly. The threat they pose is negligible, because in order to progress, you typically have to overcome all of them, and you do this quite frequently. While in 7 and the earlier entries, the enemies need to induce panic and anxiety. The answer isn't necessarily to overcome the foes, but simply survive them. You don't have to go shooty bang bang all the time. Sometimes running away is the best or even only option. If the player starts to feel comfortable around these threats, then the main appeal dissipates, and you're not left with much else to fill the void. Yet again, this crisis of identity comes into question. What is Village? Where is it trying to land on the Resident Evil survival horror spectrum? Well, it's predominantly trying to act as a sequel to 7, and will continue to be for the future, but just like I've shown, there are still flashes of its action-oriented other half that just don't work with the overall tone it's been focusing on. Alright, I do believe I've beaten this topic to death. Let's transition to the best portion of the entire game, the Beneviento house. After that long tangent, it shouldn't surprise you that my favorite area has Ethan losing all his weapons and healing. There is no combat or even a boss fight, but there are still enemies, or at least one that we'll see soon. The entire section has one focus: horror. It begins with Ethan seeing Mia down this path. Of course your wife is dead, so the odds of this actually being her are pretty slim. However, that doesn't stop the protagonist from chasing after her. She seems concerned about Rose, and for good reason, as the potential darkness surrounding the baby is the main focus here. I kinda skipped over it, but the goal right now is to collect the various pieces of Rose from each of the 4 lords in order to revive her. Apparently they split her into 4 pieces during some ritual, and even though you think this would kill her, the child's essence is still alive. I thought this was a series about viruses and advanced technology. What on earth is this mystical mumbo-jumbo? Honestly, just try not to think about it too hard. The stories of Resident Evil aren't exactly the pinnacle of writing to begin with. Knowing this information, it wouldn't be a stretch for Ethan to be subconsciously wary of his own child, and that is made manifest here. After chasing down Mia and a brief elevator ride, you reach the Beneviento house. Yet again, try not to think about why there's an elevator out in the middle of nowhere. The house itself is peaceful, as was the walk over, granting a great view of the nature hidden below. Despite there being no danger, the player feels on edge once they enter the house. This is the home of one of the 4 Halloween rejects, and if Dimitrescu is anything to go off, they're more frightening than they initially appear. It certainly doesn't help that these creepy dolls are hanging around the house. You might find yourself giving them second glances just to see if any of them may have suddenly decided to have a will of their own. Sometimes an effective way to create tension is simply the unspoken threat of something just waiting to get you. The house is eerily quiet, and the threat of these dolls claws at the back of your mind. Alas, it seems the game is content with having you look around, as there isn't anything here. Ethan travels down yet another elevator where he comes face to face with Angie, a doll capable of talking and movement. Man, those secret underground labs are long gone, aren't they? She then steals all of your equipment and taunts Ethan about his daughter. The lights flicker and reveal a life-size doll of Mia on an operating table. From here, Village plays like the Lucas birthday party room of death from 7. You don't have access to any of your equipment, and you have to solve puzzles while being exposed to various horror elements. The first is having to take apart Mia limb by limb so you can collect items in order to progress. The act itself isn't all that dark considering she's made of wood, but the implications of Ethan adjusting the eyeball of his wife's corpse and tearing off her limbs for his own gain is powerful. At one point, he even sticks tweezers into her mouth. The puzzles in the area further push this along, having you clean the blood off of Mia's wedding ring to find a code to a door, realigning the wedding music box from the very beginning of the game, and properly organizing a family film reel. These tasks don't pose much of a challenge, but it's the symbolism and how they contribute to the overall theme that matters. As you advance, the radio in the room plays clips of your wife's voice. It begins with her overjoyed at the baby inside her being so energetic, but as you advance, they get dark and twisted. Mia seems to have some kind of secret, and the game uses environmental storytelling to great effect in order to clue you in. This picture of a pregnant woman falls over on your way back to the doll. I wonder what exactly that's trying to imply. As you continue to progress, you see flashes of Mia, one down this hallway and another on the other side of this door. Ethan's wife seems to be panicking at this point, and I'm sure he wants to comfort her and get some answers as to what she's been hiding. However, she's always just out of reach, disappearing right before the husband can get to her. At this point, Mia gets more and more desperate, at one point calling Ethan on the phone, telling him she had to hide it from him in order to protect their family. She couldn't bear the idea of losing them. After a trip down a well, everything that's been building up reaches a boiling point. You're bombarded with the howling wails of a child's cries. The poor thing just won't let up, and as you continue to listen, it dawns on you that this is actually similar to the sound a child makes when they first leave the womb. Ethan returns to the autopsy room, only now a sinister shade of red hangs over the area. The doll of Mia is gone, replaced with a massive splatter of blood, although you do hear her voice one final time, insistent that everything will be fine, desperately trying to convince herself of this fact. The main chamber door is open, and a trail of blood beckons you forward. Along the path is some kind of cord leading right from the table Mia used to be at. I wonder what it means. Suddenly a screech rings out and a giant grotesque abomination peeks out of the darkness. As you flee, the creature starts to playfully giggle, almost like a baby, with the final nail in the coffin being the twisted dada the monster shouts with murderous glee. The cat's out of the bag. Mia's big secret has been revealed. This thing hunting you down is none other than Rose. I don't have a single negative thing to say about this nightmare-fueled horror show. The build-up is fantastic, messing with the corpse of Mia, how all the puzzles relate back to the theme of pregnancy and family, the way the title taunts you with the Mia hallucinations being just out of reach, and all the wonderful environmental storytelling. Seriously, an umbilical cord leading from the implied bloody mess that used to be Mia, how Ethan climbing out of the well mirrors a baby leaving the womb. This is some fantastic imagery that has a shocking amount of detail put into it. The secret behind just what exactly is going on is fed to the player in such an effective way. The voice clips of Ethan's wife get more panic-stricken and fearful, leading you to wonder just what exactly happened. What can't she tell us? And why would the family be destroyed? Though none of this is even the best part. The reveal of demon baby Rose and how she stalks you down the corridor is fantastic. In a fear-inducing way, that is. I wouldn't touch that slimy thing with a 10-foot pole. The constant giggling and screeching of Dada really digs away at you, adding a whole other level of psychological horror. I especially love when it corners you in the room and you're forced to hide under the bed to avoid it. Finally getting a good look at just how deformed and revolting Ethan's daughter is. The fear of Rose catching you has been nurtured since she appears, but it all culminates when you're just about to make your escape. The elevator needs to come back, and Rose isn't going to make it easy, forcing you to kite her around this table as she blitzes you with even more wails and giggles. Eventually the elevator does arrive, and just when you think you're safe, the game punches you one final time. These doors won't shut, and it looks like Ethan is about to be devoured by the gaping hole that is Rose's mouth. Thankfully they do shut just in the nick of time, but the pause really does get you, creating one final heart-racing moment to top it all off. A truly fantastic nightmare that I couldn't just stop wanting more of. Easily the best thing Village had to offer, and it certainly didn't disappoint. After this, you confront the Lord who put you through all this trauma. Ethan chases down Angie as all the other dolls in the room threaten to awaken at once. The moment itself is good, but in comparison to what we just went through, it doesn't really add up. That's not meant to be criticism though, and the doll chase was a nice way to finally end this madhouse of death. Yet again, no complaints whatsoever from me. This was easily the peak of Village, and sadly it's never going to match this quality ever again. In fact, it's going to get worse, pick up a little bit, and then slowly peter out towards the end, creating a second half of the game that doesn't measure up to the first. I already spoke about the combat sections happening directly afterwards, that being these Moroikas and the Varkolak, so I won't waste your time talking about them again. Besides this, Village has you immediately heading off to face another one of the 4 lords, the one in question being Moreau. Moreau's entire area mostly acts as his boss arena that climaxes with the battle itself. He transforms into a giant fish, and in order for you to escape, Ethan has to drain the water from the dam. The problem is there is no power, so Captain Ordinary has to brave the waters in order to start up one of the windmills. The main theme of this task is that Moreau is hunting you down as you attempt to complete this goal. The intended purpose was to create another David vs. Goliath situation. You can't harm the Fish King, and the circumstances of being in his domain are intimidating. That is until you actually start running around, and the guy ends up being a massive pushover. Most of the time he's just flailing around, posing no threat to you at all. There are plenty of moments where you're given time to solve puzzles or figure out what to do next while he just lurks in the background. It certainly doesn't help that Ethan decides to interject with his terrible one-liners.
Caught myself a big one.
Seriously, what purpose does this serve? It's not funny, and all the cheesiness does is make this already poorly executed section even worse. There are a few moments where Village picks itself up and actually tries to make Moreau competent at the whole killing you thing. You barely manage to get by as he quickly swims towards you, and him jumping at you while riding in the air is a nice touch before restoring the power to the dam. However, besides that, most moments have no sense of tension or panic at all. You can confidently just stand around twiddling your thumbs or beating your head against the awkward bridge puzzle with no worry that Moreau might swoop in and devour you. Instead, this should have been a high-stakes chase where one false move would have resulted in Ethan quite literally swimming with the fishes. Moreau is a giant fish. This is where he's at his best, and the situation should reflect that. Having a puzzle is fine, but make it a timed event. Perhaps even have Moreau ramming against some kind of structure you're inside, adding more tension as the room you're in slowly falls apart, with Ethan just barely managing to get by like he always seems to do. I've said it plenty of times and I'll say it again, if there are no stakes, the player starts to get comfortable, and when they're comfortable, there's no room for any kind of fear. I've spoken at length about some of the minor Village sections and how I don't like what they represent, but they weren't huge blunders or even really bad. This is Resident Evil 8's first major misstep, creating an awkward encounter that completely falls flat. I find this to be really odd, especially in comparison to the sheer quality of the Beneviento house we just left. The game has clearly demonstrated it knows how to make an effective encounter that doesn't rely on combat or large groups of enemies to get the job done. Why wasn't this better executed? Because that's what the real problem is. The concept is sound, it's just in practice a bad product was delivered. To put a more positive spin on Moreau's domain, his actual boss battle is one of the better ones in the game. It's similar to Dimitrescu in that he transforms into a giant monster that has a humanoid weak spot. You also spend most of your time running away and dodging attacks by rounding the corners of various structures in the arena. Now that I think about it, it's mostly an enhanced version of the previous big battles with a few new additions. Moreau comes across as more of a threat because his attacks don't rely on the geography of the area as much as Dimitrescu. Dimitrescu constantly rams you from the same corners. Moreau will assault you with melee attacks if you get too close to him, and spew long-range acid that can somehow hit you through buildings. I'm not quite sure how that one works. Despite the attack itself not making much sense, I think it's an important move in the fish's arsenal. Only having to round the corner to dodge his spray and pray would be pretty lackluster, as it would be a joke to overcome. Instead, you have to continue moving so you don't get clipped by it, adding more pressure to the player, making sure they never feel quite safe. Another key difference between the two lords encounters is Moreau's weak spot isn't tangible at all times. It's only available after he has performed an attack, meaning you can't just create some distance, shoot, and then repeat. Instead, you have no choice but to put yourself in harm's way to deal meaningful damage. This is further exemplified by his spray not having much of an opening, meaning the best attack to bait out is his melee moves. This creates a risk versus reward kind of situation. It's easier to make a mistake if you get too close, but it's also the best way to effectively damage the boss. The only piece of criticism I have is after dealing enough damage to Moreau, he'll perform this acid rain attack. The first time he performs this move, there's very little indication as to what he's going to do, so when death from above starts pouring down on you, it's pretty difficult to not just die outright, creating a cheap situation where the player is punished rather harshly while not being given enough information to effectively dodge this move. On subsequent fights, this attack doesn't pose any threat at all because the animation signaling its arrival is incredibly long, giving you plenty of time to run for cover, essentially defeating the purpose of the move entirely. The final comment I want to make is on the barriers that block off various parts of the arena after the acid rain. These are a strong addition, making the player experience some of that terror as you desperately try to erase the blockade before Moreau corners you. This is especially effective when you reach a dead end you weren't expecting and Moreau is hot on your tail. Overall, I think this fight is one of the best in the game. Moreau's character may be a little on the pathetic side, but you can't help but admire his tenacity, desperately trying to finish Ethan off, never letting you have a moment's rest as he constantly follows after you. The fight represents a good combination of the uncomfortable anxiety the game has mostly been focusing on, alongside the more action style of gameplay, demanding quick reflexes and accurate shots in order to hurt Moreau where it hurts. With evil Quasimodo finally being put to rest, the final Lord, NCR Ranger Dropout, contacts you through a TV. Yet again, just try not to think about it. He acknowledges Ethan's tenacity and offers to work with him if he can pass a test. He wants the protagonist to go to some stronghold and get the final rose flask. If Ethan succeeds, he passes. As you might have guessed, this is where we're headed next. The Stronghold is a prime example of how to make effective combat situations for a survival horror game long past the point that resource management was a problem. It also marks the transition from emulating Resident Evil 7 to embracing the style of RE4 and later games full on. The beginning plays like a quality encounter from the former. Our old good friends the Lycans are scattered around this hilly environment, acting as the main obstacle Ethan has to overcome in order to reach Heisenberg's flask. Notice the term overcome, not survive. You aren't expected to run past these enemies. Instead, you have to face them full on and use all your available tools to defeat them. It feels like something ripped directly out of the latter half of the Resident Evil series. Lycans run at you, fire flaming arrows from a distance, and you're expected to respond in kind, using the sniper rifle to pick off the ranged foes from afar, and quickly pumping the grounded wolves full of lead with the shotgun or pistol. I think you get why this feels so much like 4, 5, and 6. So since I nagged about this very thing during earlier sections, where's the part where I unload about how this undermines the main tone of the game? Well, if this was the only thing this section had to offer, perhaps I would be inclined to do exactly what you're expecting, but the beginning portion of this section is only half of the battle. Once you defeat 2 waves of Lycans, you're given a moment of calm. There's a gate blocking your advance, and Ethan has to pull 2 levers to lower it. Seems easy enough, until you pull the first lever, and waves upon waves of Lycans respond in kind. Not exactly happy that you're trying to invade their precious home. This is what makes the Stronghold such a powerful moment that manages to maintain the panic and terror found in the earlier sections of the title. It's a nervous sprint to the other lever, and then you're forced to wait as the gate slowly lowers, with each second creating more and more dread as the monsters start to surround you. This is copied yet again once you enter the Stronghold to even greater effect. The entire situation feels like the intro of the game on repeat, except there's a fundamental difference. In the intro, you have practically no supplies. The only option is for you to run. The arena is designed in a way so this is possible, ensuring you don't have to face the Lycans head on. The Stronghold doesn't coddle you in the same way. You're forced to face the Lycans and actively fight back against them. Village knows you have accumulated a fair amount of resources at this point, and it's taking advantage of that to create an encounter that demands you use them. However, unlike the typical fights showcased in 4 and 5, you aren't expected to actually defeat every Lycan and move on. The numbers game is just too much for Ethan, and while he can certainly take out a steady supply of them, he's stirred up the hornet's nest, and there is no way he can take out the entire hive. This is a prime example of what I meant by implement the struggle to survive into the gameplay. This is a fantastic combat encounter that has the player partaking in the shooty bang bang, but there are still stakes and genuine tension as you sprint through the area. You're throwing explosives, firing off shotgun shells, and blowing up barrels, but despite this huge amount of strength, it simply isn't enough. You fear for your life as you just barely manage to fend off the pack of animals. The zombies aren't trapped in a room with Chris, a boulder-punching Redfield. Boring everyday Ethan is trapped in a room with ferocious werewolves just waiting to devour him. With the conclusion of the Strongholds, Ethan obtains the final flask and is invited to Heisenberg's factory for a chat on that whole working together thing. This final dungeon plays independently from every other section previously. I said the game was going to embrace the latter half of the series, and the factory does exactly that. Let's begin by focusing focusing on Heisenberg. His entire persona feels out of place in comparison to evil vampires, creepy dolls, and black-robed abominations. I make jokes about all of them, but Heisenberg is really hard to take seriously. He's lighthearted, cracking jokes and speaking in an over-the-top way with a voice smooth as silk. Even his outfit feels out of place in comparison to the others. Dimitrescu may look human, but her skin is a sickly pale green, and she's over 9 feet tall. Dog Tags over here looks like he could be a hobo off the street. If I turn my attention to that discussion between him and Ethan, it's all over the place. This scene tries to be comical, with some revving noise interrupting the Lord multiple times, although this completely falls flat and only serves the purpose of undermining the threat Heisenberg poses. Then there's a bit of an exposition dump, and it all ends with Ethan not willing to work with the Metal Man. The Lord isn't too happy about this, and shoves you down into the depths of his factory. In regards to that exposition dump, I've been purposely ignoring most of it because it hasn't been relevant. Filling in the necessary gaps, Mother Miranda, some all-powerful crow witch thing, kidnapped your daughter in order to revive her own. Apparently she can change her appearance at will, and is extremely powerful. The reason Miranda gives each lord a piece of your daughter is to act as a test to see if Ethan is worthy of joining her family, or something. This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense considering once you finish off Heisenberg, she just shows up and rips Ethan's heart out. I'm not quite sure how that works with joining the whole family thing, but whatever, it's Resident Evil, I'm not here for the story. Heisenberg wants to murderize her because she forced him to be part of her family against his will and treated him like a lab experiment. The Ranger knockoff explains this to Ethan in the least convincing way possible. He's impatient and clearly just wants to use his daughter's powers for his own ends. Buddy, if you want to manipulate someone into doing something that doesn't fit their interests, you at least have to make it appear as if it'll benefit them. So he isn't intimidating or good at manipulation. All he's got is charisma, but that's not exactly something a villain in a survival horror should excel at. At the very least, they need to have something about them that contributes to the player actually being wary of them. Sitting down and having a nice chat with a guy who meanders on in such an over-the-top fashion only hurts the tone the game has been trying to maintain, further contributing to the crisis of identity. Am I supposed to be scared while playing Village? Are the enemies supposed to intimidate me? Or is the focus just this poorly done, stereotypical villain that offers little value to the experience the game has been trying to deliver for most of its runtime? The factory Ethan inevitably gets thrown into has the exact same problem as its owner. The gameplay simply doesn't mesh together with the experience so far. The factory features more enemies that the game actually wants you to defeat than any other area before it. During the castle, most enemies are thrown at you early before you can acquire a healthy amount of ammo. The Beneviento house features none at all, and Moreau only has this one small area. Of course there's the stronghold, but the objective there is to merely survive, not necessarily defeat every Lycan. I've said this plenty of times, but the title is trying to make you feel weak, because without that there is no tension, anxiety, or fear. All that's left is running and gunning through every encounter. Now on its own that isn't necessarily a problem, but when everything leading up to the factory has been attempting to accomplish something else, regardless of how successful it was, one has to wonder what kind of experience the player is supposed to have. You will be fighting groups of haulers as early as the first 3 minutes you enter the factory. There is no reason to feel any form of intimidation from these guys at all. You have plenty of ammo and are even given powerful new guns to further increase your damage output. The enemies themselves are just Moroikos with visors on, meaning they hobble towards you as slowly as possible and their attacks are pathetically easy to avoid. Village doesn't seem to realize this though because the title tries the same narrow corridor with lots of obstacles trick again, except this time you can easily shoot your way through with no problems. There are even some times when you're supposed to be shocked by some spontaneously appearing behind a corner, or when opening a door. While this may initially surprise the player, they can easily collect themselves and kill the monster put in front of them, leading to cheap jump scare like shock instead of anything meaningful. The factory does have one other type of foe with various versions, although whenever a new one is introduced, they only show up once and in limited quantities. Taking a look at the traditional one, in theory I can see where they were going with this cyborg, but in execution it's a flop. They're meant to behave like mini stalker enemies. They block their weak point and only open it up for damage whenever they attack, making it much more challenging to actually defeat them. Sounds good until you plop them down in the levels they inhabit. Just like with Dimitrescu, there typically aren't any other obstacles to deal with when being chased down, making it trivial to kite the robots around the area they appear in. This is further exacerbated by the levels themselves all functioning as a giant loop, meaning you never get cornered and can easily maintain a safe distance from them, neutralizing much of the threat the cyborgs are supposed to have. Their attacks are also pretty slow, much like the Hauler, making it a simple task to bait out an attack and then shoot their weak points until they fall. This can be used to completely eliminate them, creating an area devoid of any threats, or used to easily stun them in case you want to walk by. However, the advanced versions do pose an actual threat to Ethan. There's a portion of the factory with these aerial types that suddenly jump at you, impeding your progress and forcing you to act fast in order to effectively avoid them. You also have to shoot these buttons to turn off the giant fan above you so you can advance, creating a scenario where you have to balance shooting targets at opportune times alongside managing enemies that you don't have enough space or time to fight, bringing back, if only briefly, a feeling of intimidation as you climb upwards. To give the factory some credit, I felt this section achieved something similar to the Stronghold, although not nearly as effective. There's also these fully armored cyborgs, but only 2 of them ever appear. I can see Village was trying to create something similar to what I just finished going over, but it's not nearly as well executed. It's comically easy to just sprint past the first one. The second one takes up the entire hallway, forcing you to face him head on. I'll admit the lighting and shock of seeing this seemingly impenetrable wall blocking your path is well done, but stunning him once and then just sprinting away is all that it takes to overcome this Goliath. Taking a look at the factory as a whole, it's actually a good section for what it's trying to be. The Heisenberg talk is bad, but I can't say the gameplay or level design is poorly done. The area is certainly unique and visually impressive. If you're going for a more action-oriented style of running and gunning through foes, then I don't have any complaints. If you're trying to emulate the Resident Evil 7 style, then it completely fails in every aspect except for some very brief moments. Now, for the most part, I don't think the factory is trying to be like 7, but the game's past haunts this section, and I don't just mean that in the typical point I keep making. While overall the factory pays homage to 4, 5, and 6, you can easily see some glimpses of 7's more horror-oriented style. The full-bodied armored cyborgs are clearly meant to freak out and scare the player. I don't think the title does this effectively, but just look at the environment. The way the rooms are darkened or have a dark red hue to them. Then there's the regular drill arms methodically chasing you down, which doesn't work for the same reason as Dimitrescu. Occasionally the robots will appear inactive, only to turn on shortly after passing them. This is similar to the tactic of the dolls in the Beneviento house. The title puts something that could harm you directly in your line of sight and attempts to make you sweat through this implicit threat. I personally felt it was obvious when they were going to turn on, making the anxiety of if/when they'll come to life disappear, although I'll admit this is anecdotal evidence. The only attempt at creating anxiety I felt was successful was the mixture between action and horror that the giant fan climb utilized. So you have a half-hearted attempt to try and keep the overall tone the game has been trying to maintain that really embodies my criticism of Resident Evil Village. I don't think most of the sections of the title are bad, most of them range from good to even great, including the factory, but you can't just judge a product by only looking at each part individually. You need to view it as a whole, and when I do that, I'm not quite sure what exactly the goal is. Every single time I bring up the distinction between action and horror, I always make sure to use the caveat of what I believe Village is trying to be. The purpose of this video is not to say what version of Resident Evil is better than the other. Now, of course, I have a personal opinion on which one I prefer, but I've tried to divorce that from this video. Like I said in the beginning, there is no right answer when it comes to what makes a game a survival horror game. So in turn, there is no correct answer as to what Resident Evil should be either. Both options are valid, and it's pointless to argue which one is better. The only thing I can argue is that Village is predominantly in the 7 camp, and trying to appease all sides only hinders the experience. Now, a game doesn't have to only focus on one thing to be successful, but if the other things it does focus on interfere with the main theme, tone, or message the game is trying to make, then it becomes a problem. This point is only further proven by the remainder of the game. After traversing the factory, Ethan confronts Heisenberg, who morphs into this giant mechanical monstrosity and shoves you down below. Ethan survives because of course he does, and we conveniently meet Chris Redfield. It's only taken the entire game, but we finally find out why he killed Mia. Turns out that was Miranda pretending to be her, and the real Mia was captured. Chris then gives you some tank-like machine, and you head off to settle the score with Heisenberg. What follows is the embodiment of a pure spectacle battle. It's David vs Goliath here, except instead of a slingshot, David has a machine gun with infinite ammo and a grenade launcher. Just a tiny upgrade if I say so myself. You could definitely feel the gradual transition from standard everyday Ethan Winters barely taking on a Lycan to going toe-to-toe with Magneto himself throughout the title, but it's here where that dam finally breaks. Any sense of weakness, tension, anxiety, you know the drill by now, is thrown completely out the window. Isn't Ethan supposed to just be a normal everyday guy? I thought he was supposed to be way over his head? Well, I guess not anymore, because now we're on equal footing as this behemoth. Just look at the transition between frantically scrambling for your life with the vampire versus this absurdity. Do I even need to repeat the point of ruining the tone of the game? I think you've heard it enough by now. As a boss battle itself, the entire fight kind of feels like an interactive cutscene. The brawl follows a very simple pattern. Constantly shoot your machine gun and fire explosives whenever it gets too close in order to put some some distance between you and him. That's the whole encounter. Eventually your tank gets destroyed in the most grandiose way the developers could think of, and the player has to quickly finish him off with their standard gear. Easily the worst boss encounter in the game, repeating the same tactic over and over again until a certain damage threshold is reached. However, things are only going to get worse. With Heisenberg defeated, Miranda finally decides to show herself. Ethan doesn't realize this immediately, even though he knows Miranda impersonated his wife. Honestly, I don't even know why I'm complaining. We all know poorly written protagonists are #1 on the gullible ranking. Crow Lady taunts Ethan about how idiotic he's acting, which is admittedly deserved, and then explains how Rose is the improved version of Evelyn from 7. Due to this, she's the perfect candidate to use to revive her own daughter using the mold. Once all this exposition is over, she rips Ethan's heart out like I said earlier, and the credits roll. I'm not quite sure if I'm sold on the villain winning in the end, but hey, I like the twist. Nah, I'm just joking. With Ethan dead, you now get to play as the Boulder himself. Now, if you want to play as an unstoppable, heavily muscled, testosterone-filled machine of death, then have I got a section to sell you. It comes complete with mowing down waves of Lycans, firing giant explosives that rain down from the sky, a ridiculous amount of ammo, and a reskin boss fight that survives said explosives from the sky. Act now or else we might run out of stock. Oh, who am I kidding? Nobody wants to buy this garbage. Playing as Chris is meant to be a pure power trip. From the way he fends off enemy attacks to the army of Lycans he defeats, the whole thing is just a testosterone junkie's wet dream. If the Heisenberg fight somehow didn't trigger the, wow, this is really over the top and nothing like the last 8 hours flag, then I hope this did. I'm not even sure what the purpose of this even is. Everything the game has been trying to achieve is thrown out the window and replaced with something completely foreign. Remember how I said you don't want to go so far in one direction that what makes Resident Evil comes into question? Well, I do believe we've hit that point. Let's just take a moment and revisit some of the footage from the beginning. Now we've got a whole squad of people all working in tandem to take on a literal army of Lycans. There's night vision goggles, military-grade equipment, overpowered weapons, the list just goes on. This is just pure spectacle that completely abandons any pretense of horror. Thankfully, this section isn't too long. Chris places some village-destroying bomb in the core of the mold and finds a captured Mia in Miranda's underground lab. Chris tells her Ethan is dead, only for her to insinuate that Ethan is in fact not normal. We then transition to some strange dreamscape where Evelyn of all people explains that Ethan died in the initial moments of 7 and that his whole body is made of mold. Due to this, he awakens and heads off to confront Miranda one last time. This is about it for the game. Ethan battles Miranda in a boss encounter that has you dumping all your accumulated ammo into the antagonist. Magnum rounds, explosives, shotgun blasts, nothing is off limits. The battle is pretty simple and ultimately underwhelming, at least from a mechanics standpoint. If you want your bosses to feel like an epic one-on-one encounter that is the culmination of all your growth over the course of the game, then this works just fine. The tells for all of her attacks are fairly obvious, and plenty of time is given for you to respond. Simply run out of the way and then blast away until she's defeated. There are some cool spectacle-filled moments, like her bombarding you with what appears to be fireballs or this darkness she engulfs the arena in. These are nice, but only contribute towards the big showdown feeling. However, there's no focus on horror, just pure action. You feel as if you're on equal footing with Miranda, which is really strange considering Heisenberg felt the need to scheme for years to even stand a chance against her. She also just casually ripped her heart out not too long ago, so I'm not quite sure how that makes any sense. Regardless, Ethan can just run in with his armory of weapons and take her down. I guess the lesson here is don't mess with a father and his child, or I don't know, something? Ultimately, Resident Evil Village is a tale of two different philosophies, the more survival-oriented and make every bullet count style of 1, 2, and 3, alongside the more horror-focused editions of 7 versus the run-and-gun shooter that focuses more on defeating waves of enemies throughout a level in order to progress with some light horror themes. The former dominates most of Village's runtime, and there are some exceptional moments that the title manages to pull off. I was pretty negative about Chris's section and Miranda's boss fight because they fundamentally go against everything the game has been trying to be before Heisenberg. If you really liked the gameplay in 5 and 6, then perhaps the title's final moments were an enjoyable experience. However, the purpose of this video is to judge Village as a whole, and when I do that, I can't help but question how I'm supposed to feel while playing the game. Am I supposed to be scared, on edge, or feeling invincible as I mow my way through waves of enemies? This is merely a theory, but perhaps the reason behind the decision to start the game like 7 and then have it end like the latter entries in the series was because of the inevitable power scaling the games typically suffer from. A lot of the appeal of 1, 2, and 3 go away once you have enough ammo that the zombies stop posing much of a threat, so instead they went for the pure power fantasy to act as a substitute. I can see why they may have gone for this approach, but in practice it just doesn't work. You can't have a title start the player as the weakest being imaginable and then end with them defeating an all-powerful being if the focus is primarily on forcing the player into situations where they feel vulnerable to create fear, tension, and anxiety. It's like you're playing a tactical RPG and then all of a sudden the camera pans behind the main character and it becomes a Dark Souls fight. It's so different from what you've experienced previously that you can't help but feel some whiplash. You're most likely not going to be happy that the game you've been playing all of a sudden dropped everything it was doing to become a completely different experience. Village adds on to this by having its major change come in direct conflict with the previous portion. If you want to combat the inevitable resource management problem, then the answer isn't to change the entire game, but instead create new situations where that accumulation loses a lot of its value. This can be done in multiple ways, and the most frustrating thing is Village implements many of them. You can just straight up take them away for a gameplay section, or throw endless amounts of enemies at the protagonist while they have to achieve something in the area. Those are just 2 examples, and both of them work really well. The factory has this walking engine trailing behind you, but the moments when it does this feel more like cutscenes where the player just so happens to be in control. They're also so brief that it's hard to feel any real adrenaline from them. I believe a much better idea would be to have this guy arriving out of nowhere multiple times, and designing the levels he inhabits in such a way that running away from him would pose a challenge. Throw haulers in the way, set down traps, place items the player may want to pick up in dangerous locations. You could up the stakes by throwing in the cyborgs to act as even bigger hurdles to overcome. This creates an enjoyable, anxiety-inducing challenge that culminates with Ethan finally defeating the creature that's been stalking him for so long. Heisenberg is the most powerful of the 4 lords, so make his fight reflect that. Ethan should be an ant in comparison to this god of metal. Make him begin the brawl by merely toying with you, but as the fight goes on he gets serious and you feel as if you stand no chance at all. Having the player scramble around the area, just barely able to dodge his metallic attacks. Some of these ideas are vague and admittedly not fully implemented, but the point is there are ways to maintain the desperate struggle to survive. To feel overwhelmed by the behemoth of power in front of you. Everything I've been talking about is from a gameplay perspective, but the title also has some problems with its tone. Ethan shouldn't be cracking one-liners when running for his life. He should be scared to the point of bordering on hysterics, not making wisecracks about a boat's size. No one would ever actually do that. The same problem can be seen with just about every villain. Dimitrescu is sex appeal incarnate, Moreau is the embodiment of the Virgin and the Virgin vs. Chad meme, and Heisenberg is so ridiculous I don't even know where to begin. It's telling that I was more wary of the Lycans than I ever was of these clowns. That's because the game actually takes the time to drive raw fear into your heart when first encountering them. The Halloween Reject meeting doesn't accomplish this in any way. To get to my conclusion, Resident Evil 8 is a good game. It isn't great, but it's definitely enjoyable for what it is. There are some gameplay hiccups I mentioned earlier like exploration, but the overall experience is good. The game is primarily a sequel to 7, and the gameplay reflects that for the most part. I would argue the only major hiccup on this end is the Moreau chase sequence. Everything else is either good or great. It's not until the last stretch of the game that the crisis of identity truly comes into play, although you can see it rearing its head earlier with some of the later enemy encounters and the castle trying to accomplish too many things at once. I haven't focused too much on the story or events, just giving enough context to understand what's going on because it's really not that relevant. Ethan isn't an interesting protagonist, and the narrative is mostly in the background until the meeting with Heisenberg, serving as an excuse to run around and fight the lords. The narrative we do get at the end is standard enough for video game writing. Chris plays hardly any role at all until the very end, as does Miranda, mainly because having them interfere would spoil the events of the title. Ultimately, I don't think the appeal of Resident Evil has ever been the story of each individual game, although its overarching lore can be somewhat interesting. I'm really just adding this in case anyone questions why I didn't bother to cover most of the narrative. To me, it's simply background noise to get me to the next stage and isn't fundamental to the main point of this video. The final comment I want to make is about the series as a whole. I asked what Resident Evil is trying to be in the beginning of the video, and that's what this final statement is going to focus on. It's clear that the franchise is divided into 2 camps. After the somewhat milquetoast reception of 5 and the backlash of 6, it's clear fans didn't like the direction the series was going. Now that didn't mean the developers had to revert back to the original formula with some innovations, but that's what they decided on, and it worked. People really enjoyed 7, going so far as to say that Resident Evil was back. So it's really strange to me that they decided to shoehorn in the other camp at the last minute, almost as if they couldn't stop themselves from giving the player a chance to control the ultimate Chad, Chris Redfield himself. I've said it so many times, but the series can't do both. Something has to give, and a decision has to be made. It isn't a healthy question to ask just what Resident Evil is. With the release of 7, the embers of identity seem to be dying out, but after the release of Village, new fuel has been fed to the flames. Only time will tell whether they're finally smothered out, or they continue to burn bright. So with the conclusion out of the way, all I have left to do is thank you for watching, thanks for watching! In all seriousness, I greatly appreciate you finishing the video. Projects like these take a lot of time and effort, probably more than you may initially think. I would greatly appreciate a sub, like, or comment. It really helps a small channel grow. Heck, even a dislike carries favor with the algorithm gods. That's all I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you for your patronage.